Doctors of Reddit, what was the most shocking case of I thought that was normal you've seen in a patient? I don't know if this fits, but here's a story about my husband. We were messing around, and he chased me through the kitchen, took a hard left turn and lost his footing, fell on his side. He's a big dude, so falling is a bit more traumatic for him. He couldn't put pressure on his leg, and knew immediately he was hurt pretty bad. He was able to crawl to the couch, and once settled, said he wasn't in too much pain. He decided to sleep on the couch that night, so he wouldn't have to go upstairs. We made an appointment in the morning for the so we wouldn't have to sit there all day, but they didn't have an opening until 2, so we just hung out at the house. He was in a decent amount of ambient pain, but it didn't seem emergent. Once we got to the hospital, we find out that he had broken his hip, in this case breaking off his entire ball joint from the top of his femur. The nurses said they couldn't believe that he was able to sit up and had slept on it, implying that we should have come the night before, and probably by ambulance. It required surgery with some hefty bolts to put it back into place. But the crazy part is that apparently a healthy 30-ish-year-old man breaking his femur from standing is highly unusual. After several tests and an MRI, it turned out he was in the early stages of osteoporosis due to a pituitary tumor in his brain. So we discovered a benign brain tumor, all because dude was wearing slippery socks edited to correct the type of tumor. I had the wrong gland. Not a doctor, but have a story. My oldest son was 11 years old and needed a physical for youth tackle football. We had a new doctor, so she went into more detail than most physicals. He had complained that his ankle hurt during the middle of baseball season, so she asked if he could take off his shoe. When he did, she immediately points to the side of his foot, where there was a strange bump, and informed us he had a broken foot. I didn't believe her as I pointed out he had the same thing on his other foot as well. She took a look and said, "Oh, he has 2 broken feet," and sent us over to get x-rays from the hospital. I was laughing thinking this was so crazy, believing there was no way my son, who not only finished playing in a baseball tournament, but who was running and jumping at the swimming pool literally an hour before, had 2 broken feet. After the x-rays were completed, my smile quickly faded as the doctor was right. That is when we learned about completely flat feet and the damage stress fractures can do when they go undetected. 8 weeks of cast and special shoes and insoles for the rest of his life solved the problem. His feet are still deformed, but it never slowed him down. I was a patient, got a new obgyn, my 4th due to moving several times, and went for a checkup. Braced myself for the horrible pain, and winced as soon as the speculum touched me. She immediately stopped, and as it turns out, extreme vaginal/vulvar pain isn't normal. But I'd just had 3 obgyns who apparently jaff that I nearly cried in pain every time I was checked. Edit, because several people in comments have asked, my doctor called it vulvar vestibulitis, and said it's called a bunch of different things, that the name gets changed every few years. I think the term most used now is vulvodynia. No known cause, maybe too many nerve endings in the area. Definitely bring it up to your doctor if you are experiencing this. From what I know now, some discomfort is normal, but the knife-like pain is not. I'm doing somewhat better now thanks to some physical therapies and a lidocaine ointment I can apply beforehand. Also, if you think you may have this and need to find a new doctor, I recommend finding a woman, and the younger the better as education seems to be improving. And talk to them before they touch you, and if they dismiss your concerns, find someone else. You don't need to worry about offending them. This is your body. Your health is more important than a doctor's feelings. If you have trouble speaking up for yourself, like I do, take a trusted person with you to help advocate for you. This one was actually from back when I was a medical student, but it's still the weirdest thing I've seen. Sorry this is long, but I promise it's worth it. It was my last rotation of medical school before graduating and starting residency. I had completed all my requirements and just wanted to take a few interesting electives of things I hadn't seen yet. This was a dermatology rotation at the VA. The rotation had been interesting and chill, and it was my last day and my 3rd to last patient as a medical student. The guy came in, and the resident asked him why he was there, and he said, "I have hair coming out of my hand." I figured he meant a weird mole with some hair coming out. But this guy, prob late 30s or early 40s, says no, the hair is coming out from under the skin. The resident asked what he does for a living, and he says he's a barber. The resident tells me that it's not too uncommon for hair to poke through the skin, especially for barbers who cut men's hair. It's short, thin, and can be kinda pokey after all, and it was sort of like getting a sliver, but with hair. But the guy says, no, it's a lot of hair, look. And he holds up his hand, making a fist, and there's several hairs poking out from between the knuckles of his pointer and middle finger. I stare in confusion, and the derm resident grabs some tweezers and pulls out a tweezer full, maybe a half dozen, of short black hairs. The guy says, yeah, I already pulled out like 50. The derm resident was like 50, so the derm resident numbs up the backside of his hand between the first and second knuckle, and makes a little incision, and starts pulling out gobs of short black hair. Chunk of 20, chunk of 30, etc. And now she's got the magnifying glasses on and the attached light and she like, oh my gosh, there's still more in there. Sir, do you know how all this hair got into your hand? And the guy goes, oh, it probably came in through there. And he flips his hand over to reveal a hole in the palmar aspect of his hand skin. Turns out the dude had cut himself like 2 years before this, and it had never healed properly. He was diabetic, and he just kept cutting hair with this open wound on his hand. And probably every day a few hairs got stuck in his hand. For 2 years. And now those hairs had tunneled through the webbing between his first and second fingers from the front of his hand, and out the backside point. Long story already, sorry. The poor resident spent like 30 minutes milking his hand and fingers while more and more hair came out. She said, there's no way I got it all out. You have to come back every 2 weeks for a few months for us to keep removing more hair from your hand. Which is a weird sentence. In the meantime, wear gloves while you cut hair. We gave the dude a whole box of latex gloves. I don't remember anything about my last 2 patients that day. It was literally my last day as a med student, and boy, what a way to go out. Still probably the weirdest thing I've ever seen, not to mention how there's some hair in my hand. Happens, I guess the guy was about it. Point edit. You my first award. Thank you, kind stranger. Also, yes, this is 100% real. I would be proud if I could make something this weird up. The other question was if the resident did anything to address the poorly healed wound in the guy's palm. Unfortunately, I don't remember the resident addressing this, but it was several years ago, so maybe she did. I was pretty shocked by the whole thing, so my memory may not be 100% reliable. I suspect a few stitches on some Dermaband cold at least closed it temporarily, as it wasn't that big, couple centimeters, but I don't remember her doing that on this visit, and I graduated, so I never saw this patient again. I imagine it was addressed in subsequent visits. Said it too. Clarification on the palmar hand wound. I described it poorly above, so hopefully this will clarify. He appeared to have cut himself deeply a few years ago, perhaps 3 to 5 centimeters, but through the entire skin. In process of healing. Remember, diabetics heal more slowly, especially in distal portions like hands and feet. The wound had healed such that the edges never came back together, effectively leaving a small, few centimeters, slit in his hand. So maybe saying open wound was incorrect on my part. More like an acquired dermal defect. A slit, though all skin layers, small enough that anything of substantial size would never get through, but large enough for hair to easily slip through. It was not draining or bleeding, red or swollen, but clearly open, meaning allowing free access to the internal environment. It was probably 3-4 cm x 0.25-0.5 cm, narrower at the edges, wider in the middle. So a wide slit. Not a doctor, but related story of major illness undetected. My son, 13-yo, complained to me that his scrotum was unbearably itchy. I figured probably sweat. Told him to wash the area thoroughly and make sure to dry well. Maybe dust some baby powder on there too. A couple of days later he said it was still itchy and getting bigger. Bigger? He showed me his visibly swollen scrotum. No pain or anything, just itchy and swollen. So that's not good, but I didn't think it was anything more than a sweat rash that maybe needed some ointment. We go to the doctor and are sent off for an ultrasound. The scan shows 0 blood flow to the area, immediate transfer to the emergency room. He goes in for emergency surgery, where the urologist surgeon removes one necrotic testicle. It had become randomly twisted, testicular torsion, and died at least a week prior according to its necrotic state. The swelling was a major infection setting in. The itchiness was caused by the infection and skin stretching. He had no pain whatsoever, and the doctor said that was amazing. For most boys, torsion feels like being kicked in the nuts continuously, and by the infected stage he was indeed expect crying and screaming level of pain. Much longer and he could have developed sepsis. We just thought it was a bit of a rash that got out of hand, and are lucky I took him to the GP and didn't just go buy ointment OTC as I had thought of doing. He had a follow-up surgery a month later to insert a fake testicle and to stitch his remaining live testicle to the scrotum wall so it can't commit seppuku like its brother. Patient here. My psychiatrist saved my life. I have always had heavy/irregular periods, so when I had bleeding that didn't go away for a month, I pretty much just kept on keeping on. Eventually a doctor referred me to an emergency department because of the constant blood loss. I got told it's because you have endometriosis. So for 5 months I had a heavy period, with doctors just dismissing it. Eventually my roommate called an ambulance. When I passed out in the shower, the doctors did a blood test, and I was admitted overnight for a blood transfusion. Fun fact, blood transfusions make some people nauseous, which is not a fun way to find out you're allergic to an antiemetic. A few weeks later, at about the 6-month mark, I drove for an hour for my regular appointment with my psychiatrist. He took one look at me and told me proceed directly to the emergency room, do not pass go. So I did, and was promptly admitted to ICU with a bilateral pulmonary embolism. I was hours away from suffocating to death. Turns out all the birth control that the original doctors had been giving me to shut me up and get rid of me had caused mass clots. The doctor that looked after me and ultimately saved my life wrote a paper on why it's stupid to ignore a nulla gravida, never pregnant, woman in her mid-20s with severe dysfunctional uterine bleeding. Patient had all the symptoms of a GI bleed, including vomiting up blood that looked like coffee grounds. Went to the was admitted and had a NG tube put in. Do not recommend. 0/10, and spent the night in the ICU. They scoped me the next day, determined I had 3 minor erosions, and released me with a script for antacids. I felt awful for the next 2 weeks. Tired, weak, headaches, dizzy, black stools here and there, but I dismissed it all because it was just 3 minor erosions and I'm stubborn and American, so medical costs were definitely also on my mind. 2 weeks later, my doctor sent me in to have my blood drawn. My hemoglobin was at 4.6 and my hematocrit was 15.1, which is critically low, like how are you still standing low? 1/3 of the blood my body usually has low point. Long story short, I was rescoped at this new hospital, and they found a 2-inch tumor in my stomach. A very rare tumor that usually doesn't happen to people under 40. I'm 33. Had a total of 5 tumors and half my stomach removed a few days later, so this feels more like my first GI doctor thinking this was just a normal 33-year-old getting their quarantine drinking on. Where he found the erosions was basically right where my 2-inch tumor was. I don't get how he missed it, but he found what he was looking for, and that was that. I guess all I know is I'm not paying the $7,200 that hospital wants from me. How they missed a 2-inch mass baffles my mind. Still waiting on the bill for the week stay and surgery in the second hospital. I was a patient. I had Roux-en-Y gastric bypass in April 2017. After I went home from the surgery, the expectation was that I would be on a liquid diet for a week and then slowly start reintroducing soft foods, etc. I even used a check-in app that reviewed how I was feeling to monitor if something was wrong. 2 weeks in, and I still couldn't keep down an ounce of protein shake. My now ex-husband was getting frustrated with me because he thought I was being deliberately difficult. While he was gone to a city 3 hours away by plane, I woke up in the middle of the night heaving and dry vomiting. My mother drove me to the hospital in the middle of the night, where I spent the next 12 hours having every test imaginable run on me. Turns out within 24 hours after my surgery, where my intestine was reconnected at the Y junction had actually come apart, leaking anastomosis, if you want to look it up. And everything I'd tried to eat had just been draining into my abdominal cavity. I was septic and had 4 large abscesses. After emergency surgery, I spent 10 days in the ICU recovering before I went home. The surgeon told my mother that if I'd been even 24 hours later getting to the hospital, I wouldn't have made it. Side note, less than 2 months later, my husband left me. Edit, not ulcers, abscesses. As a patient, some of these are on me, some are on the medical professionals, but pretty understandable. Some both went in for ongoing issues with generally feeling unwell. Doc said I probably had pneumonia, and when I asked about my toe hurting he said, probably just broken, nothing we can do. Next morning my leg was 3x its normal size and I went into septic shock and had a seizure. They never figured out the pathogen, but I had cellulitis in my leg. In spite of being in the hospital a week, I still had no idea anything serious had happened. Never heard of sepsis except regarding menstruation, until a doctor came in, looked at my leg, and said I don't think we'll have to amputate anything. Afterwards, learning the drugs they gave me, I realized I had come pretty close to dying. Another time I started hallucinating while totally sober and in fine health. I thought it was a little funny, but NBD. Once it stopped I was sort of on the fence on whether to do anything, so I called my parents' doctor's office and spoke to the nurse. She said I should probably go in just to be safe. I really didn't want to deal with the costs. She asked if I had anything else wrong. I kinda laughed and said, nah, I mean I woke up with a sore neck, but that's life, eh? She told me to go immediately to the ER then. I had had a stroke. One other time I got food poisoning. I'd never had serious food poisoning before, but my boss who I was at a conference with had. After clearing myself completely in a very short period of time, I told her I would probably miss the next day. She asked if I needed anything. I said, no, I'm just trying to drink water, but I can't keep it down. I've put all my pillows on the bathroom floor, so I can stay close to the toilet. She brought me ginger tea and asked if they could take me to the hospital. I declined and tried the tea, which also came back up. I was still heaving and got to the point I could hardly get up, so I let her and a coworker drive me to the hospital, but I felt so stupid. Who goes to the ER for food poisoning? They stabilized me in the ER after a few hours and ran some tests. They told me then I could go home if I wanted, or stay the night in the hospital if I preferred. If you can't tell, I'm really the sort to not worry about health and assume things will be fine, but some instinct told me to stay. I felt like shit when they wheeled me over to the hospital, and I told them that. Next thing I remember, I was on a hospital bed surrounded by med staff. I had had a seizure. From alone as a patient, I've always had headaches, almost daily. About 10 years ago, I started seeing weird auras that would take up my whole vision, and then get a terrible headache that made me want to die. Maybe once a year, that would happen. About 3 years ago, we got really good insurance. Then I got several auras right in a row, and I start to worry it's a detached retina or something. So I go and see an ophthalmologist, who dilated my eyes and looked around. He suggested I see a neurologist, and maybe they'll do an MRI. Meanwhile, I had a stomach ache that lasted a few days. Very odd for me, since I don't really get them. But it woke me up in the middle of the night one day, and I had another aura visual, but no headache. Saw the neurologist a week later, and boy did he like talking about how fat I was. I had 3 kids in their years. I'm squishy, not morbidly obese with little motion. Deal with it. They were able to get me in for the MRI that day, and despite being claustrophobic, it wasn't terrible. I walked out to the parking lot, and they called me and asked me to come back in. When I got in, she told me I'd had a stroke, and they needed to admit me to the ER. The office was at the hospital already, so she literally just walked me through like 2 doors, and I didn't even have to wait in the lobby. Spent 3 days being poked and prodded. I never really saw the big deal. It was just a stomach ache and dancing lights. I'm doing a lot better now. Not a doctor, But when I was in high school I would have terrible period cramps. They were so bad I would throw up and would be shaking. I couldn't pay attention in class and literally failed exams because the pain was so bad. My mother told me that was normal and that I needed to stop making such a big deal out of it. A friend told me that going on the pill would make my periods easier, but that was not allowed. I was told to drink more water, do more exercise, or use a hot pad point. As soon as I turned 18 I went to Planned Parenthood and asked to be put on the pill because I was sexually active. I assumed that if I told them it was because my periods were so painful I was throwing up, they would just think I couldn't handle being a woman and would not give it to me. The pill helped, thank goodness. It's been 12 years and I've never had a non-hormonally induced period since then, and I'm now on my second hormonal IUD which prevents my periods entirely. I only just learned from my gynecologist that what I was experiencing was not normal and may need to be looked into further. If you have painful periods, it isn't your fault, and don't let anyone make you think it is. It is also not normal. No young woman should have to go through that. If your parent doesn't believe you, find another adult you trust who may be able to help you. Patient here. I had been suffering from debilitating pains basically since I was 14 years old. They would be worse around my periods and kind of dull down a little after. I was told this is normal. At 18, I started searching for answers because the pain was getting worse. I went 7 different doctors in 6 years. I was either dismissed as it being normal period pains or being misdiagnosed. One doctor tried to tell me it was irritable bladder syndrome. I'm no medical student, but even I know that's not a real diagnosis. I was on all kinds of different birth control and pain medication which didn't help. At 23, I was finally able to see an OBGYN who specializes in pelvic pain. She barely even touched me before she was saying, "Oh my, you have endometriosis," and scheduled me for the first laparoscopic surgery in January. During that surgery, not only did they find that I have the highest and rarest severity of endometriosis with complications, but they removed several golf ball sized cysts that were ready to rupture. She told me I must have a really high pain tolerance because I should not have been able to walk upright into her office that day with everything that they found and removed. The most amusing part of this: before seeing the specialist, I had 3 ultrasounds and several other exams, but no one detected or even bothered to look for endometriosis or PCOS. It was that simple pelvic exam that saved my life. One night, when I was 16, I had a very sharp pain in my right side. I tossed and turned for a couple hours before getting up and knocking on my mom's bedroom door, a forbidden action. My mother swung the door open and snapped at me what did I want, and when I explained my pain, she told me it was heartburn, to drink some milk and go back to bed. I drank the milk, tossed around my bed for a few more hours, and finally passed out from exhaustion. Next day, I felt fine. A couple months later, the pain was back, and I again woke my mother. Same response. I eventually passed out from exhaustion again. The next time I felt the pain, I didn't bother going to my mother and just rode it out. This continued until I was 18. My parents were out of town one weekend and the pain came back worse than ever before, waking me from a dead sleep. After hours and hours of utter agony, hurting to move, hurting to lay still, I broke down and called my mother, leaving her a voicemail that I thought I was dying. I finally passed out as the sun began to rise. I was woken by my uncle banging on the front door and he took me to the doctor, who referred me to an ultrasound office, who had referred me to a surgeon. While I saw the first to the same day, the surgeon didn't have an availability until the end of the week. Didn't think anything of it as, once again, the pain was now gone. Mom begrudgingly takes me to the surgeon appointment, but I'm pretty sure she thought I was faking it, since I'd been completely fine all week. I remember sitting in the office with the surgeon, just chatting while we waited for the nurse to bring him my ultrasound file. I'll never forget when she handed it to him. He opened the folder and the smile immediately fell from his face. Surgeon, did they give you any pain meds when you went to the doctor? Me, no, just some antibiotics. Y.S. To nurse, Nancy, call my 2 o'clock and tell them we have to reschedule as I'll be in emergency surgery. to me. You should have been sent to me last week. I'll meet you in the air. So yeah, my gallbladder had apparently been filled with stones since I was 16 and making more still for the last 2 years. The surgeon said he'd never seen anything like it, and my mother told me she overheard some nurses' questions how I was still walking. I guess mother didn't think that her mother having her gallbladder out at 16 and herself having it out at 18 was worth considering. When I first woke her with pains in my side, I thought I just had heartburn. Not a doctor, just a patient, but the doctor told me that my alarming symptom was normal and I should just ignore it. When I was pregnant, I told the family doctor that my hands and feet were so itchy that I felt like I could scratch them till they bleed, and he shrugged it off and said it's a normal issue in pregnancy and not to worry about it. I live in a community where our hospital can't handle labor and delivery, so we are instructed to go to the city 2 weeks before our due date. Lucky me, I go into labor 3 weeks before my due date. My blood pressure is high too. Great. Now I'm getting an ambulance ride to the big city. I get there and everything has stabilized. Maya gave me blood pressure medication, so they tell me to go home and wait out the labor pain. I'm in a ton of pain already then, and tell them so, and they say, it's normal, don't worry. I then reminded them I took a multi-hour ambulance ride to get here. Oh gee, you should get a hotel then. I come back in 2 hours in even more pain and ask if I can have an epidural. Nope. I'm freaking exhausted. They say I can have laughing gas, but that's it. Didn't do a thing. Finally get to active labor and they are telling me to push with the next contraction, and I tell them I can't tell when I'm having a contraction because I've been in pain for so long that I don't know when anything has changed. I think it clicked with one nurse then, and she got wide-eyed and gave me a shot of Demerol. Didn't do a thing. Then, after I've had my baby, luckily there were no lung problems etc. Somebody mentioned my liver enzymes. But nothing is really explained to me. Turns out they were insanely and dangerously high. The best guess was that I had obstetric cholestasis. I had to do the legwork on that one myself and asked the specialist that I saw months after my baby was born, and he said it is highly likely that was it. If my pregnancy had gone full term, it's highly likely my baby would have been stillborn. I know God was watching over me for that. It took about a year for my liver numbers to normalize. But you know what it took for the doctors to take notice of my liver and send me to that specialist? My father's death. When I was about 6 months pregnant, we visited my parents. Hadn't seen them for maybe 3 months. I immediately noticed Dad's skin was jaundiced and insisted he go to the doctor. Turns out he's in liver failure. He is not a drinker. It was NASH, and he was in liver failure. For the amount of damage, the specialist said it was 15 years of extremely slow progression that had gone unchecked. Dad had been lethargic recently, but he just chalked it up to being old. He was one of those walk it off old guys. Nothing ever bothered him. To make it worse, Dad went to the doctor every year for his checkup. Checking liver enzymes is not a part of the yearly checkup. I repeat, checking liver enzymes is not a part of a yearly physical. His family doctor was shocked, and I really hope that he added that to his yearly checklist for all his future patients. Dad's official death was from complications due to cryptogenic cirrhosis. It was brutal and heartbreaking, but he was around just long enough to meet his grandchild and hold the baby more than once. So after getting this stellar level of treatment, it makes me constantly second guess myself. Are these symptoms normal, or am I overreacting? Turns out I'm not overreacting, because I've got more than a few things going on health-wise. Yay. Man, I wish doctors would take women's pain and symptoms seriously. Patient here. I had traveled internationally and started having bad stomach problems. I have vibes and assumed my change in diet while traveling triggered the symptoms. I considered going to a doctor, but was worried I'd get stuck with a huge bill for a foreigner visit over probably nothing. I made it through a few more days feeling thoroughly shitty, no pun intended, and somehow made it through the 2 long flights and long car ride home. Thankfully I had an aisle seat for both flights, since I was constantly getting up to use the bathroom. I arrived home on a Sunday evening, and that Monday was a federal holiday, so my doctor was closed. My insurance charged a lot to go to urgent care. Thanks US insurance. so I figured I'd wait until the following day to go to the doctor. At this point I'm still thinking it might be IBS, but starting to think it might be food poisoning. When I see the doctor, she immediately prescribed such a strong antibiotic that she also prescribed an anti-nausea medication, so I could keep it down. I get my test results back a few days later, after I'm already feeling better, and discover I spent a week with E. coli and Campylobacter, another foodborne virus. Had I known how sick I was, and how quickly antibiotics would help, I would have gladly paid the premium to see urgent care, or even the foreigner. A very seriously heart problem. Exact cause I don't know. I work outpatient, and we transferred to hospital and I never heard about the follow-up. That would be someone else's job. That caused the patient to pass out frequently, sometimes daily, and be extremely winded up a single flight of stairs. Apparently just thought they were overweight, and that it was normal. We had to explain that passing out for zero reason is not normal, that you should tell your doctor about it. The problem itself was sort of off and on. I mean, the cause obviously would always be there, but the symptoms came and went, so we didn't even know initially either, because our initial vitals all looked good. Then second set was very not good and none of the meds we had helped, so we ended up sending to hospital. Heart rate was extremely high and pretty sustained period of time, like 45 to 60 minutes with us. Not sure how long continued, so this patient was passing out because of a lack of oxygen. Heart was beating too fast to properly circulate and oxygenate blood. Apparently had been a problem as long as they could remember, so it was their normal. Never once came up to doctor. The worst part to me is that this had been happening since at least a teen if not younger, so their parents never brought them to doc or mentioned while there. Patient story. Came off my bike during lunch break at a real slow walking pace after the wheel jammed on a gutter. Went over the bars and had a nasty fish landing. My right wrist swelled up almost instantly and so I isolated it thinking it was a probable cause fracture and then proceeded to walk the 1.5 kilometers back to the office. In cleats, with carbon fiber shoes that had no flex in the soles. Had to push the bike to. I was in a lot of pain so took myself off to the Alfred for scans. The triage nurse assessed it and came to the same conclusion I did. Was given an ice pack and the doctor came around and ordered rays. I was in tears the entire time the films were being done, and I don't normally cry either. The only comfort from the radiology tech was there's a reason why you're crying, but I'll leave that to the doctor. Turns out I had sustained bilateral radial head fractures and broken my left wrist. The swelling in my right lower forearm was a reaction to the broken radial head. Spent 8 weeks in akimbo slings and then another 3 months of OT to teach my biceps how to bend my arms again, and even now I only have 90% bone strength in those joints. Click like motherfuckers too when doing chest presses, and it hurts like a beach in the cold. Second time was self-diagnosed appendicitis. Had RLQ pain throughout the day, then felt really poorly by the evening. My brother took me down to the ED and the docs there came to the same conclusion. Had it out the next day. My brother thought I was hamming it up and went off to my parents' house for dinner after dropping me off with the protestation of if it turns out to be nothing, you can catch the train home. He came back later that night to be told I was actually spot on with the diagnosis. Boy did he feel shit after that. My freshman year of college I had a really bad sore throat for a few days. I thought nothing of it and just took a shit ton of Tylenol until it went away. About a month later I noticed the joints in my fingers were extremely sore and I could barely make a fist. Next it was my wrists, elbows, knees, ankles, etc. It reached all my joints and muscles. It even hurt to lift my eyebrows or touch my scalp. I couldn't roll over in bed. I literally just lied in bed for days and cried. Finally my mom, who lived about 4 hours away, came and took me to the drive, and he diagnosed me with something called post-streptococcal arthritis. Turns out I had strep throat a month prior, and because I didn't treat it with antibiotics it spread through my body and caused arthritis in literally all of my joints. He prescribed a steroid and painkillers and said good luck, man. I've had a lot of medical problems in my life, but this one was the worst by far. It took another 3 months for me to start feeling normal again, and a full year to be completely back to normal. Now I catch strep throat extremely easily, and I get it at least 4 to 5 times a year. If I don't get it treated within 2 days, the arthritis flares back up again. Oh, fill out the paperwork, because I couldn't see it well enough to fill it out on my own.